What can change the nature of a man?
I'd like you to imagine that the current month and year is December 1999. Both the holiday season and Y2K are upon us. Before the world ends in nuclear war, you figure you might as well find one great game you can play before you explode like Sarah Connor does during the Terminator 2 dream sequence. Maybe you gift this particular game to yourself, or you ask a loved one for it. Regardless, there are numerous legendary games to choose from. Pokemon Gold and Silver, Dino Crisis, System Shock 2, Silent Hill 1, Crash Team Racing, or maybe the most emotionally invigorating game made in the pre-2000s era, Pepsi Man. You look at all these games on the store shelves, wondering which one would provide you with the best experience, and out of the corner of your eye, you see a blue face staring you down. Planescape Torment? What is that? Unable to glean anything about the game just by looking at the blue face, you likely picked up Pokemon and called it a millennium. I say you would have likely done that because in the first few months of Planescape's release, only 73,000 copies were sold. In its retail lifetime, it is estimated that Planescape Torment sold only 400,000 copies. It's hard to say that picking up Pokemon or any of the other games instead of Planescape Torment was a bad decision. Virtually all of them were of such great quality that they served as archetypes for imitation for decades to come. It must be said, though, that all these games have aspects that were surpassed in quality by sequels, spiritual successors, or even games that came before. But for Planescape Torment, I would argue that it has one quality that has yet to be surpassed 23 years later. Its philosophy. While many games, like Deus Ex or Fallout New Vegas, have wonderful philosophical narratives, often woven by player choice, their philosophical elements are one of many equally important cogs working together. In regards to Planescape Torment, the philosophy is the cog. It forms the foundation of every aspect of this game. When you choose a faction, when you recruit a new party member, when you speak to a random person in the street, at every moment, Planescape Torment invites the player to consult with their own philosophical outlook. This kind of philosophical self-examination isn't the type of thing you tend to see in more popular RPGs, like the ones made by Bethesda, BioWare, or the Witcher games, even though those games are legendary and have worthwhile philosophical elements. With Planescape Torment, the philosophy goes into the realm of the academic, and I mean that technically. Each of the characters and factions in this game are fictional representations of various real-world philosophies, including pessimism, nihilism, Epicureanism, just to name a few. And as you interact with them, you learn more about them than, honestly, you would in a philosophy class. But most importantly, by interacting with them, you also learn more about who you are, your moral outlook, why you act the way that you do, why you should or shouldn't change your nature, and the biggest conundrum of all, if you even can change your nature. I will be providing a spoiler-free analysis of this game's philosophy, save for the very last section of the video where there will be spoilers. But before I do that, I need to make a confession. As most of my regular followers know, my primary goal online is to spotlight the most profound forms of media that I can find, with the majority of my attention being given to the medium of video games. For years, people have told me that Planescape Torment was one of the primary examples of a profound game. People particularly made this opinion known when I did my top 10 lists of the most profound games and gaming moments, when I didn't mention Planescape in any capacity. I will admit, I ignored the game for the longest time due to certain prejudices. I don't like top-down views in games. I don't like Planescape's style of point-and-click movement and combat, on and on and on. Like most prejudices, they impeded me from seeing something of great value. Now that I have played Planescape Torment, I can confidently say that the game deserves a place on both top 10 lists, maybe meriting a place in each of the top 5. I'm not ready to say where, however. That will be a discussion saved for another time. What I will say is that while it might not be the most profound game or have the most profound moment, it is without a doubt the most philosophical game ever made. And now I am going to explain why. Let's begin with a little bit of background on the lore. The world of Planescape originated as a part of the Dungeons & Dragons brand. It's one of many campaign settings that stand alongside the likes of Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, Icewind Dale, Ravenloft, and more. There are a few important factors that separate Planescape from those other settings, however. The most basic factor is that where those other campaigns only focus on one small segment of the D&D universe, the Planescape setting incorporates the whole universe, one that houses 5 primary planes of existence, or rather 5 categories of planes. Unlike the Planescape tabletop setting, where you can theoretically travel to all 5 planes, the Planescape Torment video game only focuses on the outer planes, and even with that, it only deals with a few specific areas. Now, when I said that philosophy forms every aspect of the game's foundation, I didn't just mean that metaphorically. I also meant that physically. The outer planes, for all intents and purposes, are the heavens, hells, and purgatories one might go to when they die. These afterlives are the physical product of all the philosophies, religions, faiths, moral systems, everything that living beings believe in strongly throughout the universe. In other words, the highest heaven, Elysium, exists because so many people in the universe believe it exists. Now, the afterlife you go to depends on your character alignment, which is predicated on 5 elements. Are you chaotic or lawful, good, evil, or neutral? So for example, if your alignment is lawful evil, you will go to a structured hell like Bator. If your alignment is chaotic good, you go to a heaven like Arborea. And if you're a lawful neutral, you'll go to Mechanus. All these planes exist as a part of what is known as the Great Wheel cosmology. These 16 afterlives revolve around a neutral center called the Outlands, which houses a spire that juts out infinitely into the cosmos. At the top of that spire is the setting for the majority of Planescape Torment, Sigil, or Sigil. Sigil is virtually the center of the Planescape multiverse, and there are several consequences for this. First, it is home to the greatest variety of creatures and philosophies from all the different planes. While this does cause a great deal of strife, it also isn't completely unlikely to see 2 different creatures in a place like, say, the brothel of slating intellectual lusts engaging in friendly philosophical debate. The game starts within Sigil at a giant mortuary. You play a character referred to as the Nameless One. This is because he wakes up in the mortuary without any memory of who he is or where he came from. Immediately, a floating skull named Mort approaches him, telling the Nameless One that there are instructions written on his back. The instructions say that if the Nameless One should forget who he is upon waking up, he should seek out a man named Ferret, who will set him on the path towards recovering his identity. From this point on, the Nameless One and the party members he recruits will encounter many obstacles in the form of monsters and puzzles. But the greatest obstacle of all will be reconciling the person the Nameless One is now with the person he was before he lost his memory. Being in a cosmopolitan area like Sigil, a melting pot of differing philosophies was bound to have an effect on the Nameless One, and depending on what order they are encountered in, they may drastically change the Nameless One from who he was for better and for worse. We'll get to the effects of these encounters in a few minutes, but I think now it's worthwhile presenting those philosophies and how the Nameless One contends with them. There are 15 factions that exist within Sigil. Their ideological alignments are based on real-life philosophical concepts, like I said before. But those systems are molded to fit the same five-factor basis that one's character alignment is based on. For example, one of the first factions that you encounter early on are the Dustmen. They believe that the cycle of life and death is undesirable. This is because life is painful, and death is illusory because, well, the Outer Planes prove that there is an afterlife. The Dustmen would prefer to transcend both concepts and achieve a state of quote-unquote true death, literal non-existence. This philosophy closely mirrors that of Arthur Schopenhauer, whose outlook on life was kind of like a pessimistic Buddhism. Now the question is how this faction would be classified using the five-factor basis. This is where a lot of the fun I had came from while playing Planescape. There's no objective answer regarding how a faction would align, even with factions that seem like open and shut cases. Even a chaotic evil faction like the Zausatex will have those that believe it is good. So whether you play the game on your own or play the tabletop version with friends, you engage in civil dialectics to determine how a particular faction aligns and which one you would join. In regards to the Dustmen, I think they should be considered chaotic neutral, tending towards evil. They are chaotic because they reject the structures of life and death, but they are neutral because, depending on who you are, you might view life as something that we are tasked with transcending, like a Buddhist, or you might view life as a cruel mistake, like Schopenhauer. Or maybe you teeter between the both of them depending on your current state. I say that the Dustmen lean towards evil because I think life is something we should try to embrace, but there will be some doomers who disagree. In the case of the Dustmen, you will encounter those who embrace their ideology, but then you will encounter someone like Sir the Skeptic who is struggling with the ideology, believing that maybe life isn't a cruel joke and true death isn't desirable. Throughout the game, there are numerous instances of acolytes and skeptics dealing with these varying philosophies, and the gamer can't help but feel compelled to examine the arguments and how they affect their allegiance. For myself, the faction I felt most closely aligned to was the Sensates. They believe that enlightenment can be achieved by garnering the greatest amount of experiential knowledge one can, be it through direct experience or through magically charged stones that make you feel various positive and negative sensations. I feel the greatest sympathy for their worldview because their ethic is something I pursue every day, doing YouTube videos. I seek out a variety of profound experiences and I do my best to elucidate their enlightening material. That said, just because this is the faction I feel most aligned to, doesn't mean it's the best or most moral. Maybe you will end up like the character Fall from Grace, who was once an evil succubus but then transcended her nature to become a more enlightened being, doing all this through the Sensates faction. But somebody else might have the same experiences and draw evil conclusions from them. In the worst case scenario, maybe all those sensations and the knowledge that is gleaned from them could drive a mortal to a Lovecraftian state of madness. Finally, as the character Serosa points out, we can't always trust that the only type of knowledge one can glean comes from the senses. Even if that were true, our senses are as imperfect as every other aspect of us, so the knowledge we glean isn't always 100% foolproof. Still, out of all the options presented to me, it seems like the best path. Before I move on, I thought it might be interesting to ask all of you what faction you think is the most moral. I will leave a link to the faction bios in the description box. Leave a comment telling us which one you would join. Now granted, of the 15 factions in the game, you can only join 5, and even if you do, your allegiance doesn't drastically affect the story's direction. That said, there are other instances in the game where your approach to philosophy will determine whether you acquire certain benefits. For instance, there is one character named Dakon that you can potentially recruit to your party earlier on in the game. In order to do so, you have to make him question his philosophical outlook. For myself, recruiting Dakon was one of the most exciting moments in the game because winning him over didn't require picking obvious dialogue choices. Rather, it felt like I had to craft a philosophical argument on the fly. When you succeed in hiring him, you experience a deep feeling of moral pride, one that I only recall feeling twice in my gaming career. One was when I sacrificed my save data in Nier Automata, and the other was when I solved a really difficult puzzle in Portal 2. And this isn't the only moment. There are several other ones that occur throughout this game, but I don't want to spoil them for those who have never experienced Planescape. They are some of the deepest, most rewarding moments you will ever have playing a video game. The more philosophical encounters you have, the more you, and by extension the Nameless One, develop a keener sense of their own identity. While this has its positive implications, there is still the issue of reconciling the Nameless One you play as with the Nameless One we were before. This becomes even more difficult when we start to realize that when the Nameless One dies, he returns to life without any memory of what transpired before his false death. This means that there is likely more than one version of the Nameless One who existed prior to when we gained control of him. This isn't a spoiler, by the way. This is a reality that is hinted at very early on. The more we begin to learn about who the original Nameless One was, the more it contradicts our own sense of identity. Though we, at first, are inclined to believe that the original identity bears the most value and should be regained, the game encourages us to ponder whether or not this is true. This whole conundrum is a genius reinvention of the classic thought experiment posed by Plutarch, one called the Ship of Theseus. According to legend, Theseus was the founder of the city of Athens, and he had a legendary ship that he used to rescue children from King Minos. After many centuries, workers have done everything they can to preserve this ship to honor Theseus's memory, which inevitably means replacing various parts of the ship. The question is, if every part of the Ship of Theseus has been replaced, is it still the same ship? Applying this question to Planescape, if the Nameless One's memory and personality was taken away in death, are we, the Nameless One we play as, the same Nameless One that came before? I'm inclined to think the answer is no. Most people's personalities are not commensurate with the original Nameless One. Though, if you think the answer is yes, let me ask you this. What if that original Nameless One did something so horrendous that you, playing as the Nameless One, can never imagine doing something like that? This question becomes even more complicated when you consider who the true Nameless One is. Is it really the original one? Are the sins of the original ours? These are questions that I've been pondering ever since the game posed them to me. At the moment, I'm trying to work out how you would define what one's true nature is. Should we do as Heraclitus suggested, and get rid of the notion that there is an original true version because people change from one moment to the next? Or is there something like a soul in each of us that never changes? A Gnostic divine spark, like what the Signer faction or the Godsmen faction believes? I'm not even going to pretend that I have the answers. All I wish to do by invoking these questions is show the numinous effect this game can have on your brain if you give yourself over to it completely. Of all the difficult questions this game poses, I still have yet to analyze the one question that this game is most famous for. Before I do, I will warn those who have never played Planescape that I'm about to spoil the Nameless One's original identity, as well as the ending of the game. I unfortunately have to do this in order to analyze the game's ultimate question. Please go to this point in the video if you don't want to be spoiled. You have been warned. Soon after the Nameless One escapes the mortuary, he finds Ferid, the man he was told to find from the instructions written on his back. Ferid tells the Nameless One to seek out a magical witch of sorts named Ravel Puzzlewell. After several hours of questing, we discover Ravel in a pocket dimension in the formation of a maze. She reveals that the first incarnation of the Nameless One came to her asking to make him immortal. This is because he, apparently, committed an act so atrocious that he would be doomed to an eternity in likely the worst version of hell. The Nameless One hoped that by becoming immortal, he could atone for whatever crime he committed, and thus change which afterlife he would be assigned to in death. She agreed, and accomplished this feat by removing the Nameless One's mortality from him in the form of a separate being. She tested to see if the ritual worked by killing the Nameless One. He thankfully revived after death, but what neither expected was for his memories to be lost upon revival. Now, before this ritual was performed, Ravel obviously asked for a form of payment. But unlike most beings, the payment she desired wasn't some form of currency. Rather, the most precious thing to her were complicated riddles. The original Nameless One had to come up with a riddle that not only she hadn't heard, but one that was virtually impossible to answer. Somehow, the original Nameless One succeeded. When the Nameless One we play as meets up with Ravel once again, she reveals to us what that impossible riddle was.
What can change the nature of a man?
When she asks us this question, we are given a number of answers to choose from. Love, hatred, betrayal, suffering. In this moment, it doesn't matter which answer you give. After all, she doesn't know what the right answer is. She's only asking you because she just wants to hear what you have to say. But is there a right answer, though? The question is so broad and unspecific that trying to give the right answer is like trying to answer who the true Nameless One is. At first, I thought the true answer might be all of the above. But if that's the case, that wouldn't explain why Ravel had such a difficult time answering it. I suppose it depends on how you define nature. There are aspects of one's nature that inevitably change. As adults, we're more likely to delay gratification than when we are children, for example. But then there are aspects of human nature that are unchanging, such as our inherent irrationality. No matter how hard we try to act rational, the spirit of irrationality will arise within us from time to time if the circumstances we face bear enough stress. Can anything change that aspect of human nature? Though it's hard to say that there is an objective answer to the question, the game, nonetheless, provides its answer. It comes during the final confrontation with the game's main villain, the Transcendent One. This being was the mortality that Ravel separated from the Nameless One's body. He is transcendent because, unlike the Nameless One, who loses his memory each time he dies, the Transcendent One gains all of the memories of an incarnation when they die. This accumulation of knowledge allowed the Nameless One's mortality to attain a transcendent state. The Nameless One is here to either kill or reintegrate this being in order to stop the cycle of reincarnation, and the Transcendent One does not want that. Before their final confrontation, the Nameless One poses Ravel's question to the Transcendent One. His response is that nothing can. Now that response is given some credibility, but with the knowledge gleaned from thousands of reincarnations. But despite this, the Nameless One retaliates with his own answer. Quote, "If there is anything I have learned in my travels across the plains, it is that many things can change the nature of a man. Whether regret, or love, or revenge, or fear, whatever you believe can change the nature of a man, can. I've seen belief move cities, make men stave off death, and turn an evil's hag heart half circle. This entire fortress has been constructed from belief. Once it made a man seek immortality and achieve it, and it has made a posturing spirit think it is something more than a part of me." The Transcendent One responds, "Your defiance will hurt you more than any wound in this place. Belief cannot change the nature of a man." The Nameless One retorts, "I think it can. I think belief could even unmake me, if I believed it enough." The Transcendent One says, "You do not possess the force of will for such a thing." And the Nameless One replies, "So you admit it's possible." With this exchange, I finally understood Ravel's struggle with this question. There are multiple potential answers, and with each of them, there are those who believe those answers are wrong. At the root of all those affirming and negating conclusions, however, is the matter of belief, of will. And it is the strongest will, the one that can bear any torment, that will make one's belief a reality, that will make a person truly transcendent. There is so much more to this game that deserves discussion. I could do a whole video discussing the other factions, ranking their philosophies in terms of moral credibility and their alignment. There's the structures of the different afterlives, the concept of the divine alphabet, the teachings of Zerthamon. The content in this game is so overwhelming and complicated that it makes the lore of Xenogears look like first grade math class. If you want to see videos on that sort of stuff, it all comes down to you guys. Give this video a like, leave a comment, share it on social media. All of that is free and easy to do, and it helps me out a lot. I once again have to give special thanks to Arcane. He is a patron of mine that greatly encouraged me to do a video on this game, engaging in several philosophical discussions about Planescape's characters and concepts. If you want to ensure the continued production of videos like this, please consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my YouTube members section. I will leave links to those in the description box. Thanks guys, and until next week, I want to remind you as always and as per usual, stay yellow.